His hands were still trembling, but not from age. The night before, a simple coffee with his son had left him dizzy, weak, as if his own body were betraying him. Today, at a family dinner, his 10-year-old grandson looked at him with frightened eyes and whispered, "Grandpa, I heard them say they're putting something in your food." The world stopped. The laughter of his son and the aroma of the stew now carried a deadly taste. The question was, could he pretend well enough to survive until help arrived? The trembling in his hands wasn't from age, nor from some passing illness. It was the kind of tremor that comes when the world you've trusted for decades suddenly begins to fracture. The words of his grandson still echoed, clinging to every thought like a shadow he couldn't shake. Drops in his food. Deliberate. Calculated. The warmth of the dining room now felt like a trap, the smell of slow-cooked stew heavy in the air, not comforting, but suffocating. He forced his expression into something resembling ease, stepping out of the bathroom with a slow, measured calm. The laughter from the table sounded rehearsed, brittle, as though even joy here had been staged. His son's voice called him over, warm on the surface, but with an undertone he could now hear clearly, like a man inviting you to sit while quietly locking the door behind you. Every step toward that table felt like walking deeper into a performance where the wrong move could end the final act too soon. The bowl of stew sat waiting at his place, steam curling upward, masking whatever bitter edge might be hidden within. His daughter-in-law's smile met him, gentle in appearance, but her eyes were calculating, searching for signs that he would eat, that the plan was unfolding. Across from him, his grandson sat tense, hands in his lap, eyes avoiding the bowl entirely. That child's nervous silence screamed louder than any warning could have. He eased into the chair, listening to the clink of cutlery, the scrape of ladles, the faint creak of chairs on polished wood. Every sound was amplified, like his senses were on high alert, reading the movement of predators in a quiet forest. His son lifted his glass in a toast, the words a ribbon of false sentiment about healing and new beginnings. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He raised his own glass, but didn't drink, letting the moment hang just a little too long, and saw his son's jaw twitch in response. Somewhere outside, the faint hum of a car passing on the street made him think of escape. But the police were still minutes away, and until then, he needed to hold the stage. They expected weakness. They expected him to comply. What they didn't expect was that he already knew, and that knowledge, quiet and heavy in his chest, might be the only weapon he had left. His spoon hovered above the bowl, the surface of the broth trembling as if it, too, sensed the weight of the moment. The steam curled against his face, carrying an aroma that would have once promised comfort. But now it carried a question far more dangerous than hunger. What had they hidden in it? He forced his breathing to remain steady, lowering the spoon back down without making a sound, masking his refusal beneath a casual glance toward his grandson. The boy's eyes met his for just an instant, wide and pleading, before darting back to his own plate. That tiny flicker of fear was enough to strengthen his resolve. Across the table, his son's smile was stretched too tightly, like fabric pulled over sharp edges. "You should eat, Dad," he said, his voice dressed in concern but laced with something harder underneath. The tone of a man who wasn't asking any more. He gave a slow nod, buying time, his fingers brushing the edge of the napkin like it was a lifeline. "In a moment," he murmured, tilting his head as if listening to something outside. It was nothing but the distant hum of traffic beyond the walls, but it made both of them glance toward the window. A crack appeared in their composure, small but visible, enough to tell him they were watching every move, waiting for the exact second their plan would take hold. He set the napkin down with deliberate care, feeling the tension coil tighter in the room. His daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her hand resting near the small container of spices by her plate, her voice low but firm. "It will help you regain your strength." The sentence carried the rhythm of instruction, not kindness, and the faintest tremor in her tone betrayed impatience. Under the table, he felt his grandson's foot tap once against his. Not a fidget, but a signal. He didn't need words to understand it. "They're watching, but so am I." He straightened in his chair, letting the silence stretch, the air between them thick enough to cut. Somewhere, beyond those walls, help was on its way, But for now, survival depended on playing his role so perfectly that no one would guess what was coming. And just as he reached for his glass again, the sound of tires crunching against gravel outside made every head at the table turn. The crunch of tires over the gravel driveway seemed to slice through the warm hum of the dining room, pulling every thread of conversation taut. His son's head turned first, eyes narrowing slightly, calculating. His daughter-in-law froze mid-motion. The spoon she held suspended just above the bowl, a single drop falling back into broth with a muted splash. Across the table, his grandson's small shoulders stiffened, his gaze darting toward the door as though silently willing it to open. He tilted his head, listening. More sounds followed, the faint rumble of an engine idling, the slow slam of doors in deliberate succession. The air shifted in the room, no longer scented only with roasted herbs and simmering meat, but with something sharper, the unmistakable scent of inevitability. His fingers curled around the armrests, holding himself steady, knowing that every second he remained calm was a second closer to the truth stepping over that threshold. His son forced a smile, the kind that strained at the edges, and spoke in a tone too light to be genuine. Probably just a delivery. But there was no delivery truck out there, and they all knew it. The rhythmic crunch of boots on stone drew nearer, the sound of authority approaching with purpose. The boy's foot tapped us again under the table. This time, not a warning, but a question. "Is this it?" He offered his grandson the faintest nod, barely perceptible, before turning his attention back to his son. The man's jaw had tightened, his eyes flicking between the hallway and the untouched bowl in front of his father. His daughter-in-law set her spoon down with more force than necessary, her hands folding together as though to keep them from shaking. Then 3 sharp knocks rattled the air. A commanding voice followed, deep and unwavering. "Police department. Open the door." The sound wrapped around the room like a steel chain, locking every heartbeat in place. And as the son rose slowly from his chair, the mask on his face beginning to crack, he knew the next few moments would decide whether this was an arrest or an eruption. His son moved toward the hallway, every step slow and deliberate, as though buying seconds to think. The knock came again, harder this time, echoing off the walls until even the silverware trembled against plates. His daughter-in-law rose half out of her chair, her eyes cutting to him in a quick, searching glance, one that seemed to weigh whether he'd already done something irreversible. He kept his posture relaxed, his voice calm when he spoke. "Better see who it is," he said, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. But inside, his pulse beat like a war drum, every thud counting down the moment the door would swing open. Across from him, his grandson sat very still, his small fists clenched in his lap, his gaze fixed on a hallway like it was the mouth of a cave where something dangerous waited. The front door creaked as his son pulled it open, and in an instant the hallway filled with uniformed presence. The first officer stepped forward, his voice clipped but steady. "Sir, we need to speak with everyone in the house." Another moved toward the dining room, his eyes sweeping the table, lingering on the untouched bowl in front of the patriarch. The scent of the stew seemed to grow heavier in that moment, as if daring anyone to take another breath. His daughter-in-law's hands gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles whitening. His son started to speak. Something about a misunderstanding, about a private family dinner. But the words faltered as a second knock of authority came, this time from inside the room. "Step away from the table, please." The shift was immediate. No one was in control anymore but the men and women in uniform. He rose slowly, placing a protective hand on his grandson's shoulder, his voice quiet but unshaking. "It's all right," he told the boy. But his eyes stayed on his son, reading the flickers of calculation, and fear crossing his face in rapid succession. This was the unraveling, the point where masks slipped, where truth seeped in no matter how tightly they'd tried to seal it. And yet, in that charged silence, he knew the real explosion hadn't happened, not yet. The lead officer's boots thudded softly against the polished floor as he stepped fully into the dining room, his gaze sweeping over every detail. The bowls, the half-folded napkins, the untouched glass of water before the patriarch. His expression didn't change, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, the kind that said he'd already begun connecting pieces. His son moved forward, palms open, voice pitched low and smooth. "There must be some mistake, were in the middle of a meal. The officer didn't bite. Instead, he raised a hand, halting in mid-step. "Sir, I'll need you to stay right where you are." The subtle authority in those words filled the room like a new gravity, pinning everyone into place. The boy's grip on his grandfather's sleeve tightened, his small fingers curling in silent fear. He could feel the tremor in them, the weight of a child trying to be brave while the world rearranged itself in front of him. His daughter-in-law's gaze darted toward the kitchen counter where the small glass jar still sat, its contents catching the light like grains of shadow. Another officer circled behind the table, crouching slightly to inspect the patriarch's bowl. He didn't touch it at first, only leaned in, taking the scent, the sheen of the liquid, the faint swirl of darker flecks beneath the surface. Then, with gloved hands, he slid it away from the table entirely, setting it inside a clear evidence container. That single movement made his son's jaw flex, a flash of tension running across his face before he forced it still again. The officer nearest the patriarch spoke directly to him now, voice steady but urgent. "We received information about potential harm in progress. Are you in immediate danger?" He didn't hesitate, his tone low but certain. "Yes." The word hung in the air, quiet yet absolute, and it was enough to shift every posture in the room. The sound of radios crackling filled the silence, instructions passing between uniforms. Outside, more footsteps approached, the echo of boots on stone growing louder. Inside, the space between each heartbeat seemed to stretch, every second carrying the weight of what was about to be uncovered. And as the boy's hands squeezed tighter, the patriarch knew the next moment would tear away the last layer of pretense. His son's face shifted first, not panic, not yet, but the flicker of someone realizing the situation had slipped out of his hands. He took a half step forward, lips parting as if to speak, but the lead officer's raised palm froze in mid-breath. "No sudden movements," the officer said evenly, his gaze fixed in a way that suggested he already knew more than he was saying. The boy, still seated, pressed himself closer against his grandfather's arm, eyes darting from one adult to another. Every muscle in his small frame was tense, like a spring wound to its limit. The patriarch felt the weight of that trust, the quiet, wordless plea that whatever came next, he would stand between the boy and whatever harm had been waiting here tonight. One of the other officers moved to the sideboard, eyes landing on the small glass jar. He picked it up carefully, his gloved fingers holding it to the light. The faint particles inside shifted like dust in a sunbeam, harmless in appearance. Yet every person at the table knew its true purpose. "What's this?" he asked, though the question was more for the record than curiosity. His daughter-in-law's voice cracked when she answered, "Seasoning for the stew." But the hesitation, that fraction of a second too long before speaking, was enough to deepen the shadows on every face in the room. The officer sealed the jar in a plastic evidence pouch, the snap of the seal loud in the stillness. The patriarch kept his eyes on his son. The man's breathing had changed, slower, heavier, the kind of breathing that came when mind was racing to find a way out. "This is a mistake," he said finally, his voice sharper now, the mask of politeness fraying. But before another word could follow, the click of the officer's radio filled the air. "Packet secured. We're bringing them in." In that instant, the room was no longer a dining space. It was a stage where every hidden truth was about to be dragged into the light. And the patriarch knew the next word spoken could decide exactly how far that light would reach. The lead officer's tone sharpened, each word deliberate. "Sir, step away from the table." His son's eyes narrowed, flicking from the jar now sealed in an evidence bag to the untouched stew, then to the boy still pressed against his grandfather. He hesitated, a half-second too long, before pushing his chair back with a scrape that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. His daughter-in-law's voice broke into a protest, thin and trembling. "This is ridiculous. We've done nothing wrong." But the officer nearest her moved in closer, his presence cutting her word in half. "Ma'am, please place your hands where we can see them." Her fingers twitched once before she complied, her eyes darting to her husband in silent desperation. The boy's grip on his grandfather's arm tightened again, this time with a jolt of fear. The patriarch leaned just slightly toward him, murmuring under his breath, "It's all right. Just keep your eyes on me." He didn't move otherwise. Not when two more officers entered from the hall. Not when a faint clink of handcuffs sounded somewhere behind him. He stayed still, steady, because he knew the moment he allowed emotion to take over, the boy would feel it too. The officer handling the jar spoke again, this time directly to the lead. "We'll get this tested right away." His words weren't dramatic, but they carried a finality that pulled the air from a room. The son shifted his stance, chest rising and falling faster, as if bracing for an impact he couldn't see but could already feel coming. The patriarch met his eyes then, not with anger, not yet, but with something colder, a silent acknowledgement that whatever played out next would not be undone. And in that instant, with uniforms closing in and truths coiling tighter, the dinner table became the edge of a cliff. The lead officer moved with quiet precision, circling the table until he stood directly beside the son. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The words landed heavy, leaving no space for negotiation. For a moment, the son didn't move. His chin lifted slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as though daring them to prove something. But when the first officer stepped closer, the smirk slipped, replaced by a tight, brittle stillness. Metal clicked as the cuffs closed around his wrists, the sound sharp enough to make the boy flinch. His daughter-in-law's breathing quickened, her gaze locking on her husband as though waiting for him to intervene. But he said nothing, only glanced at her once, eyes flat, before looking down at the floor. The tension between them was loud, without a single word. The patriarch's hand stayed firm on his grandson's shoulder, his eyes following every movement. The uniforms moved like clockwork, one officer securing the jar, another taking photographs of the table, a third stepping toward the kitchen to search for more. Each action pulled another thread from the fabric of the lie that had wrapped this room so tightly. The daughter-in-law's turn came next. "Ma'am, stand up." Her chair scraped back slowly, the weight of inevitability in every inch she moved. She glanced once toward the patriarch, and in that instant he saw something unexpected. Not guilt, not shame, but a flicker of panic that was almost pleading. Before he could decipher it, the cuffs were on her wrists, her head lowered as she was led toward the door. The boy leaned into him, whispering so faintly it was almost swallowed by the noise. "It's really over, isn't it?" He didn't answer, not yet, because while the arrests were happening here, he knew the story was far from finished, and the most dangerous truths hadn't even been spoken aloud. The officers guided them toward the front door, their steps deliberate, the sound of boots against hardwood echoing through the hallway like a slow drumbeat. His son glanced back once, just once, and in that fleeting moment their eyes locked. There was no apology there, no trace of the boy who had once followed him around a workshop with endless questions. Only a cold, flat recognition, as if to say, "You've won this round." His daughter-in-law stumbled slightly as they stepped over the threshold, her wrists bound, her hair falling forward to shield her face from a cluster of neighbors gathering beyond the flashing lights. The boy pressed himself closer to his grandfather, his breath quick and uneven. "Aren't they going to jail?" he asked, voice small but steady, like he needed the answer to be solid enough to stand on. "Yes," the patriarch murmured, his tone quiet but certain, though his chest felt heavier than he expected. He'd imagined this moment, imagined proof, imagined justice, but not the bitter aftertaste that clung to it. Watching his son being placed into the back of a patrol car didn't feel like victory. It felt like cutting out a part of himself he could never get back. The lead officer approached. Speaking in a lower voice meant only for him. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a full statement. Tonight, get some rest and keep the boy close." The patriarch nodded, his gaze never leaving the cruiser, as its doors shut with a deep, final thud. His son looked out through glass for a heartbeat before turning away, disappearing into shadow. The boy's hand found his again, small fingers wrapping tight, grounding in the present. The patrol cars began to pull away, their lights casting shifting red and blue across the walls of the house, colors that felt both like warning and release. And as the last vehicle disappeared down the street, the house was left in silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was a kind that whispered, "This is only the beginning." The house felt different once the last patrol car turned the corner. bigger somehow, emptier, its walls holding on to the echoes of voices that would never feel the same way again. The faint scent of stew still lingered in the air, heavy and unwanted, a ghost of the evening's danger. He guided the boy toward the living room, each step careful, as if moving too quickly might shatter the fragile calm that had settled. They sat together on the edge of the couch, the boy's knees drawn up slightly, his hands still curled as though holding on to an invisible rope. "Will they ever come back?" the boy asked, his voice barely louder than the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The patriarch looked down at him, the answer pressing against his tongue, heavy with truth, but he chose the only words that could keep the boy steady tonight. Not for a very long time. Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, the red and blue reflections finally gone, replaced by the steady glow of the streetlight. In the quiet, every small sound became magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft, uneven rhythm of the boy's breathing. He realized that even with the immediate danger gone, the weight of what almost happened would follow them for a long time. He rose and went to lock the door, turned the bolt with a decisive click. The boy's eyes followed him, and for the first time that night, there was a hint of relief in them, but also something else. Something he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror after surviving battles of a different kind. The beginning of vigilance, the quiet readiness to never be caught unaware again. He returned to the couch, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll get through this," he said, the promise steady, though he knew the road ahead would not be smooth. Because under the quiet surface of this night, there was a truth still waiting to rise, one that could change how the boy saw everything, including him. He stayed there beside the boy for a long moment, letting the quiet settle, letting the weight of the night press against him until breathing felt easier. But deep inside, his mind wasn't resting. It was working, turning over the same question again and again. How had it come to this? He had raised his son to build, not destroy, to protect, not betray. And yet, somewhere along the way, the lessons had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The boy shifted slightly, resting his head against his grandfather's side. That small, instinctive gesture lit something fierce in him, a reminder of why he had survived tonight, why he had to keep surviving tomorrow. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said quietly, his voice steady enough to convince the boy, if not himself. The truth was, fear had simply changed shape. It wasn't the fear of what they might do. It was the fear of what might still be hidden. In the distance, he could hear the faint echo of a siren, fading toward the horizon. It wasn't meant for them, not anymore, but it still pulled his thoughts back to the flashing lights, the uniforms, the moment when the lies collapsed. His son's eyes, cold, unblinking, still hovered in his memory. That look hadn't been born in one night. It had been growing for years, quietly feeding on ambition and resentment until it no longer resembled the boy he once knew. He knew there would be courtrooms ahead, testimonies, days when the boy sitting next to him would have to face the two people who had nearly taken him away forever. The thought made his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm as he said, "Tomorrow, we start making sure they can't touch you again. Ever." The boy lifted his head then, studying his face with a seriousness far too old for his age. "And you too, right? You'll be safe?" The question cut deeper than he expected, because he knew safety wasn't a promise he could make without lies. Still, he forced a small smile and said, "Yes," but in the back of his mind, one thought would not leave him. If tonight taught me anything, it's that danger doesn't always leave when the door closes. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the soft, uneven rhythm of the boy's breathing from the next room, the house settling around him in slow creaks and sighs. Every shadow on the wall seemed to hold the outline of the past few hours, the jar of the cuffs, the look in his son's eyes that said more than words ever could. Even in stillness, the weight of it all pressed on him, reminding him that this wasn't an ending, it was a first step into a different kind of fight. When morning light finally crept in, it felt pale and reluctant, as though even the sun was hesitant to touch the memories of last night. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the boy, and stood for a long moment at the window, watching the street. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, manicured lawns, tidy driveways, yet he knew the balance here had shifted. The illusion of safety had been fractured, and now everything was seen through that crack. By the time the boy woke, he had already brewed coffee, the steam curling like a question in the air. "We've got a busy day ahead," he said, keeping his tone light. The boy nodded, but his eyes carried the same seriousness as before, that new layer of caution that no child should have to wear. Over breakfast, they spoke of practical things, statements, meetings, what would happen in court, but underneath it all was an unspoken vow. They would not be caught off guard again. Later, as they stepped outside, the crisp air bit their faces. Somewhere nearby, a car engine idled longer than it should have. He noticed it instantly, his body tensing before his mind caught up. The driver was hidden behind tinted glass, motionless. Nothing happened. No door opened. No voice called out. Yet it was enough to remind him that even when enemies were taken away, danger had a way of finding other faces. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steering him toward the car. "Let's move," he said quietly. And as they pulled away from the house, he kept checking the mirrors, not out of paranoia, but because something his gut told him the most important battle hadn't even started yet. The drive into the city was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt loaded, as if both of them were holding back questions they weren't ready to voice. The boy stared out the window, watching rows of houses pass like pages in a book. He didn't want to read anymore. His small hands rested in his lap, fingers twisting together, a silent echo of the tension humming in the air. He kept one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror. That same dark sedan with the tinted windows appeared again, 2 cars back, maintaining a steady distance. It could have been nothing, a coincidence, a stranger on their morning commute, but something about the precision of its movements made his chest tighten. He eased his foot off the gas just slightly, watching to see if it adjusted in sync. It did. The boy noticed it too. "That car's been behind us since we left," he said quietly, as if naming it might make it disappear. The man's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I see it. No sudden moves, no hint of fear. Not yet." They were heading toward the precinct anyway. But if this was more than chance, arriving there might not change the fact that someone was watching. A red light stopped him near an intersection, the sedan rolling to a halt 2 cars back. For a brief second, he thought about getting out, walking straight toward it, and seeing who sat behind that black glass. But there was the boy beside him, his safety taking precedence over every ounce of curiosity. The light turned green, and he took a different route. Sharper turns, narrow streets, testing whether the tail would follow. It did. That was when the feeling settled in fully, heavy and certain. Last night's arrest hadn't ended the threat. They had only flushed it into the open. And now, somewhere behind that glass, was the next move in a game he couldn't yet see, but one that was already in motion. He took another turn, sharper this time, into a narrow lane lined with old brick buildings whose windows reflected the pale morning light. The sedan followed, its shadow sliding over the same cracked pavement, its pace unbroken. He could feel the boy's eyes on him now, searching his face for any sign that this was still under control. "Keep looking forward," he said softly, his tone steady, though every muscle in his body had gone taut. The lane ended at a crossroads. To the left, the route to the precinct, familiar, crowded, safe in theory. To the right, the industrial district, quieter, with fewer witnesses. He chose left, pressing the accelerator just enough to make the tires hum against the road. In the mirror, the sedan matched the move perfectly, not hurrying, not hesitating. Whoever was inside knew how to follow without spooking their target, but not well enough to hide the intent from someone who had spent a lifetime reading danger. They hit another red light, and this time he angled the car just enough to catch the faintest movement inside the dark vehicle behind them. A silhouette shifted, broad shoulders, still posture, and then the driver's head turned, though the glass made it impossible to read their eyes. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. The boy leaned closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is it them?" The question was a knife in the air between them, sharp and unavoidable. He didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because saying it aloud would make it real before they were ready. Instead, he scanned the intersection, watching the cross traffic, counting the seconds until green. When it came, He made his move, a sudden, unplanned turn down a side street that twisted like a vein to the older part of the city. The sedan reacted a beat too late, hesitating at the corner before sliding in after them. That hesitation told him something important. Whoever was following wasn't just watching, they were deciding, waiting for the right moment to close the distance. And as the buildings closed in on either side, blocking the open sky, he realized they were running out of places to turn. The walls of the narrow street seemed to press closer with every yard. The cold bricks swallowing the sunlight until the air felt heavier, tighter. He kept one hand firm on the wheel, the other resting near the gearshift, ready to react. In the rear view, the sedan had closed a gap. Not enough to touch, but enough for him to see the faint gleam of the windshield wipers, unmoving despite the dry air. The boy's breath quickened, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the shadow, following them. "Where does this go?" he asked, his voice quiet but edged with urgency. "Somewhere we can turn this around," he replied, though the truth was less certain. He knew these streets, but not like this. Not with the added weight of someone else's intent pressing against his back. Up ahead, the road bent sharply to the left, curving out of sight. He took it fast, tires brushing the edge of the curb, feeling the car's weight shift beneath him. In the mirror, the sedan followed with the same precision. No hesitation this time, as if the driver had decided that whatever they were waiting for was now. A low hum rose in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a familiar readiness. The same instinct that had kept him alive in other moments where the ground seemed to give way beneath him. He glanced at the boy. "Seatbelt tight?" The boy nodded, gripping the door handle like an anchor. The street opened briefly into a wider stretch, but it was empty, no pedestrians, no traffic. Just their car, the tail, and the silent question of what would happen when the distance between them finally vanished. And as the sedan edged closer, its shadow stretching across the road to meet them, he realized there was only one thing left to do. He pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, feeling the hum of the engine deepen, the vibrations traveling up through the steering wheel into his hands. The empty stretch ahead was both a gift and a trap. It gave him space to gain distance, but also left him exposed, like a lone figure in the center of a spotlight. The boy kept glancing over his shoulder, each time with a little more fear in his eyes, as if expecting the other car to suddenly lunge forward. The sedan didn't rush. It matched their speed with unnerving precision, keeping just far enough back to avoid suspicion from anyone who might be watching, though there was no one. The world around them felt deserted. The buildings shuttered, the sidewalks barren, as though the city itself was holding its breath. He tightened his grip on the wheel, calculating routes in his head, but each option narrowed into the same unsettling truth. There was no easy way out. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A narrow side street, barely wide enough for two cars to pass. Without warning, he swung the wheel hard, tires screeching as the car veered sharply into the alley. The boy yelped, bracing himself against the dashboard, but didn't complain. They sped down the uneven pavement, the echo of their tires bouncing off brick walls on either side. Behind them, the sedan hesitated for only a second before following, its headlights slicing through the dim shadows like twin blades. The space was tight now, the sound of the engines amplified, making it feel as though the other driver was breathing down their necks. He knew if they caught up here, there'd be nowhere to go, and no one to witness what might happen next. The boy turned to him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why don't they just pass us? What are they waiting for?" He didn't answer, because he was starting to think the answer would change everything. The alley spat them out onto a cracked stretch of road that cut through the back of an abandoned industrial block, the air thick with the scent of rust and damp concrete. He pushed the car harder, feeling the strain in the engine, but the sedan's headlights stayed fixed in the mirror, unwavering, steady, deliberate. It was no longer just a chase. It was a hunt, and they were the prey. The boy's small hands clutched the dashboard, his voice trembling as he said, "They're not going away, are they?" He didn't answer, but his jaw locked tighter. He had seen this kind of patience before, not from drivers, but from predators, the kind that waited until their target had no escape. Up ahead, the street narrowed again, hemmed in by tall, looming warehouses that seemed to lean inward, swallowing the sky. The silence between the growl of the engines was oppressive, each second stretching longer than the last. He could feel the boys' gaze on him, searching for reassurance. But all he could offer was a grip on the wheel that turned his knuckles pale. Then, without warning, the sedan closed the gap, its headlights swelling the mirror until they filled his vision, bleaching everything else from sight. A sharp swerve from behind made the rear of their car lurch, tires skidding dangerously close to the wall. He corrected the wheel in a heartbeat, but the message was clear. This driver wasn't content to follow anymore. The boy's voice broke into a whisper, as if speaking louder might invite something worse. "If they catch us, will they let us go?" His answer was a shallow breath, his eyes fixed forward, because deep down he already knew. The sedan lunged forward, closing the last sliver of space between them, its grille so close he could almost hear the hiss of its heated engine through the night air. The road ahead ended in a fractured T-junction, left toward the main strip, right into the skeletal remains of the river bridge. Both routes carried danger, but the bridge was worse. The boy's breath quickened beside him, the kind of shallow, clipped gasps that came from fear trying to outrun oxygen. His small voice cut to the roar of the tires. "Don't let them take me." It wasn't just a plea. It was a promise he was trying to extract, one that weighed heavier than the car itself. The impact came without warning, a violent jolt that threw the wheel from his grip for half a second. The sedan had rammed them hard, the rear end fishtailing toward the wall. Metal screamed against concrete as he wrestled the wheel back, adrenaline flooding his arms like wildfire. The boy yelped, clutching at the seatbelt as though it could anchor him to the world. In the mirror, the driver's face was just a shadow framed in harsh light, but there was a glint, cold, certain, and unshaken. Whoever they were, they weren't bluffing. The next strike would be harder, deliberate, final. He knew then that staying on the road meant handing themselves over. He slammed the gear down, yanked the wheel toward the bridge, and felt the tires shudder against the uneven planks. The sound changed, no longer the hum of asphalt, but the hollow, rattling echo of old timber that might not hold them. Behind, the sedan followed without hesitation, its lights burning to the dark like twin threats carved in fire. The bridge swayed under their weight, gaps between the boards flashing glimpses of the black river below. One wrong move, 1 inch too far, and they'd drop into the freezing water. But worse than that, if the sedan caught them here, there'd be nowhere to run. And just as the end of the bridge came into view, a sound tore through the night, not from the car behind them, but from above, a deep, groaning crack of something massive giving way. The groan above grew sharper, splintering into a crack that echoed to the hollow ribs of the bridge. He looked up just in time to see a section of the old suspension beam twist in its socket, the cables trembling like frayed nerves under too much strain. Each sway of the bridge now had a voice, an ancient, exhausted moan that promised the end was seconds away. The boy's hand clung to his sleeve, knuckles white, eyes darting between him and the rear-view mirror. The sedan was still there, closer than ever, headlights cutting through the mist, their reflection dancing on the black water below. But something in its movement had changed. The driver's aggression tempered, slowing, as if they too had begun to sense the bridge's limits. The wind funneled through the open gaps and planks, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of the river's icy breath. He felt it in his bones. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about surviving the next 30 seconds, about making a choice that could decide if they walked away or vanished into the dark. The sedan crept closer, one cautious push at a time, its tires humming against the old timber. He could almost imagine the driver calculating, weighing the risk of the bridge collapsing under combined weight. A part of him hoped they would back off. Another part knew they wouldn't. And then, the loudest snap yet. The left railing burst free, chunks of wood tumbling into the abyss below. The bridge lurched, sending a violent shudder through the steering wheel. The boy's voice broke into a sharp cry. "We can't stop now." He pressed harder on the accelerator, the boards beneath them protesting with every turn of the wheels. The far side of the bridge was so close, he could almost taste freedom, but the sedan's light still burned in the mirror, unyielding, relentless. Somewhere in his gut he knew, whatever happened next wouldn't just end the chase, it would end something far bigger. The far end of the bridge loomed ahead, its concrete pillars barely visible through the veil of mist. Each second felt stretched thin, every heartbeat colliding with the groans of the timber beneath their tires. The sedan was still there, a shadow with burning eyes, but its movements had grown hesitant, as though the driver sensed the bridge's patience wearing thin. Then came the moment he'd been waiting for or dreading. A deep, splintering crack tore through the air, the kind of sound that didn't just happen. It announced something final. The planks on the sedan gave way, swallowing its rear tires in an explosion of splinters and dust. The driver gunned the engine, but the bridge had already decided its fate. Metal screeched. Lights swung wildly, and in one violent lurch, the car slid backward into the dark river below. The silence that followed was deafening. Not absence of sound, but the kind that carried the weight of what had just happened. The boy's hand, still gripping his arm, trembled but didn't let go. They crossed the last few feet of the bridge without a word, the board sagging in relief as the tires touched solid ground. On the other side, the wind was softer, but the night felt heavier. He pulled over, killed the engine, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Somewhere in the distance, the river claimed what was left of the car, its surface swallowing all evidence of the chase. The boy finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "We made it." But the man's eyes stayed on the mist-shrouded bridge behind them. He knew survival wasn't the end. It was the start of something far more dangerous. Because whoever had sent that car wouldn't stop here. And deep down, he understood, the bridge hadn't just been a crossing tonight. It had been a warning. One they could never afford to ignore again.